All right, folks, we're going to get going right on time here, so we have plenty of time for questions and all that. So for next slot on our executive track, we've got Michael Cusumano. Michael's a professor at MIT, specifically at the Sloan School, and more specifically, I think it's interesting, Michael was actually Dharmesh and Brian's professor 10 years ago, and was Dharmesh's thesis advisor. So a lot of the ideas that he's going to share today, I believe, were part of those discussions way back then, and should be an interesting talk. Thanks.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here. I remember when HubSpot was just a gleam in Dharmesh's eye, and Brian, of course, had deep expertise in sales and was convinced that the internet was going to change completely the way we did sales and marketing. So that was his vision, and of course, Dharmesh knew how to take that vision and put it into code. So today, though, I'm going to talk about another set of visions that drove the founding of several companies that we're all very familiar with: Microsoft, Intel, and Apple. And we'll look at the ideas of Bill Gates, Andy Grove, and Steve Jobs. Three very complex individuals, but my co-author, David Yoffie, who served on the Intel board since the mid-1980s, and it's really tried to distill how these guys thought and what drove their companies. So David's been an insider at Intel for 25 years. I've been very close to Microsoft since early 1990s and also Intel. And both of us have been trying to understand this phenomenon that we call Apple. Okay, so the book is Strategy Rules, and Brian invited me to talk about it. All right, so first, this point that these are three very different guys. Gates, privileged background, learned how to program a mainframe in high school. Also learned how to program the earliest Intel microprocessors in assembler. And he did that really late years of high school, early years at Harvard. Andy Grove, a Holocaust survivor, born in Hungary, escaped the Nazis, came to the US, did a PhD in chemical engineering at Berkeley. Two very technical guys. And then we have Steve Jobs, kind of a flower child, product of the 1980s, an orphan, lasted a semester in college, but had a very different perspective on the world. So again, we're going to talk about that. So three very different people, never really compared before as a set of guys who really laid the intellectual foundations for high-tech strategy in much of the world as we know it today. Three incredible records in terms of building companies, generating profits and sales. I don't have to go over this record, but it is interesting to point out that, again, Gates was there from the beginning. Grove was employee number one at Intel. He wasn't a founder, but early on took over the COO role. When he took over the company, they were losing money. And Jobs in his early tenure also lost hundreds of millions of dollars. It wasn't until later that he figured out how to become the tremendous company that we see today. This is another point that we deal with in this book, and that is the franchises that they created. And even though Gates stepped down in 2000, Grove a few years before that, and Jobs in 2011, the franchises they built, the platforms they built have continued and actually grown. And Microsoft has actually done better than one would expect under our friend Steve Ballmer. But actually, it's the missed opportunities that make us feel that Microsoft is not what it could have become. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that was. So as I say, we look at both the ideas behind these companies as well as the legacies they left and the succession issue. So the book we organized into 5 principles or strategy rules. And David and I, as we sat down to do this, we sat down actually just after Steve Jobs' death. I was preparing an article on the legacy of Steve Jobs, and David suggested that we write this book. Again, we had both been observing these companies for 25 years, and we figured this is a time now to write this, that the record of Jobs is now closed. We kind of knew what the record of Gates and Grove was. And I'd say in our first or second conversation, we came up with this list of principles or rules that really seem to drive these 3 very different companies. So again, this is what really struck us, that we have three very different companies, but really a common underlying approach to strategy. So the first principle, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this today, is this idea of look forward and reason back. They all worked off the same information at that time. This was in the mid-1970s for Gates and Jobs and also Grove. Extrapolated and then interpreted and then actually built very specific plans to make this vision of the future happen. So again, it's not that these three guys were clairvoyant or saw the future, but they actually figured out a way to execute on and make the future happen that they wanted to. So again, I'm going to talk a bit more about that. The second principle that we think they all shared was, we call this make big bets though without betting the company. So they never really put their companies at financial risk of failing. The guy that took the most risks, because he had the least to lose, was actually Steve Jobs. And we talk about that, particularly in the 2000s. But they were very clever at making some bold moves because, again, you don't change the world without making bold decisions. But they timed their bets, they hedged their bets, they had alternative plans, and they did this in a very clever way. The third principle, and I've written about this myself for the past 20 years, was to build platforms and ecosystems around those platforms, not just standalone products. And again, I'll say a couple more things about this, but the idea here is particularly in high technology, you can't dominate a market just by having the best product, the best technology, the lowest price, or even being first to market. The kinds of products we see in software, in the world of the internet, telecommunications, these are interconnected products. And again, who understood this first and how quickly was very important to the success and the timing of these companies. But it was a very early recognition that really led to the tremendous success we saw, particularly at Microsoft and Intel in the early years, and then Apple in later years. The fourth principle, or the strategy rule, we call it exploit both leverage and power. And again, here we've introduced terms of strategic judo and strategic sumo. And these are terms that David and I actually introduced in a book we wrote in 1998, Competing on Internet Time. This was about the battle between Netscape and Microsoft. And the idea here is you use the weight and the strength of your opponent against your opponent when you're a small company, which IBM was the giant that all three companies had to deal with in the early days, for example. Microsoft was very clever with how they partnered with IBM. When the internet appeared, they were very clever in how they embraced and extended Netscape standards and Java standards, incorporated them into Windows, and then into Office, for example. At the same time, when these companies had market power, they used it like a hammer to squash the competition. All three of them, by the way, have at various times violated antitrust laws in the United States and elsewhere. So again, exploiting power can be very dangerous, and you have to understand how to do this. One of the problems with, or one of the great merits of platform industries is these positive feedback loops that we call network effects can lead to this winner-take-all or most phenomenon. So successful companies in these domains generally end up with very large market shares. And again, that exposes them to all sorts of antitrust violations. However, if you're clever, you can still use that market power. Microsoft, for example, used Windows as a delivery mechanism for Internet Explorer, as well as other products. And again, used its power. It overused it, but that's another story. The final strategy rule or principle we talk about, and this is more a message to entrepreneurs, is that you really need to shape the company around, we call it a personal anchor. In other words, you need to understand what you're really good at, what you really understand, and use that as a foundation for building your company. But you also need to understand what you're not good at. And in the case of these three companies, in many ways, they were very personal. Microsoft is even today still an extension of the personality of Bill Gates. Very technical, doesn't care very much about consumers, for example. right? And Apple, this tremendous understanding of design and the user interface for the average user or the average sophisticated user, not necessarily the Bill Gates of the world or the PhDs like Andy Grove. That kind of culture has really continued in these companies, and Intel very dedicated to process and engineering and manufacturing. And these are the anchors that really these three guys built their companies around, very, very personal, but not until they understood where they were weak and how they could build teams to compensate for their gaps in knowledge and interest were these companies successful. Okay, so that's our simple set of rules or guidelines for three complicated companies. Let me go back to this issue of look forward and also reason back. So we talk a lot about vision in the world of strategy and entrepreneurship. And I mentioned before that Dharmesh and Brian had this vision that the internet was changing the way we do sales and marketing. And there wasn't a company out there that really had a toolkit that could help traditional companies as well as startup companies navigate this new way of pulling in customers through social media, for example. So that was their vision of the future. And again, they built a company to execute on that vision in very specific ways. So here's what we also think Gates, Grove, and Jobs did, in some ways on a much grander scale. So again, the points: extrapolation from what you know is going on, the facts that you can see around yourself. Interpretation, you have to interpret what that data really means. And not only what it means in general, but for your specific company and your specific market context. And that's a particular point of view. So you do need to take a stand and make a judgment. What do you think the world would be like in 1 to 3 years or 5 to 10 years? Okay. And in the case of these three companies, that actually led to essentially vision statements that were very simple and clear as to what they were going to do. The next part, though, is harder. How do you reason back? How do you take that vision of the future and then figure out, okay, what can I do today to execute on that vision? What can I do 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now, okay? And do that very consistently. That's how you build a company. Now, what's interesting about this perspective is that it kind of goes with, but also against, our natural inclinations. Most of us actually want to learn from history. So we actually tend to look back, what happened in the past, and then reason forward, not necessarily look forward and reason back. Now, Gates, Grove, and Jobs did this. They were astute students of history in many ways, Gates in particular. Very familiar with IBM, that the mainframe had become a kind of platform, that it was cloned by other hardware companies and software companies, built systems and maintenance and service businesses around it. And he kind of figured out that would happen with the IBM PC. Grove also was a student of history. He had worked for Fairchild Semiconductor, and Fairchild invented a lot of critical semiconductor technology, but never had the discipline to really mass produce it. And when he was a co-founder of Intel in 1968, he vowed this would not happen at Intel. He would imbue that company with the discipline necessary to mass produce semiconductors. And it took him quite a while to do it successfully, but he did it. And Jobs was really a child of Silicon Valley. He grew up admiring companies like Hewlett-Packard and the very elegant engineering culture that was surrounding him, and he wanted to actually build a company around that. So they did look back and had some sense of what they needed to do today based on what had been done in the past. But really they looked forward, and they extrapolated off of a set of information that was commonly available by the mid-1970s. And we think great strategists and entrepreneurs need to have this ability. And if they can't do it themselves, they need to have a small team around them that enables them to do this kind of extrapolation and interpretation. Okay, so here's where they all worked off of the same set of facts, and it was Moore's Law. I guess everyone in this room is deeply familiar with Moore's Law, right? Right? Okay, so Moore's Law was expressed in a small paper that he wrote in 1966. The thinking and the data actually came from 1965 or so, working in Fairchild Semiconductor. And he had looked back over the past 10 years. He was asked to predict what the future might look like. And he said, well, based on the last 10 years of data, it looks like the number of transistors on a silicon chip is doubling every 18 to 24 months. Okay, so that was a statement about what the past was. Now, this had become common lore in the high-tech world in California, Silicon Valley, computer science departments by the mid-1970s. So Bill Gates, again, as you probably know the story, the apocalyptic story, he and Paul Allen were viewing a magazine on electronics and saw a PC kit. This was 1975. Gates decided to drop out of Harvard and create a software company. And in their vision statement in the 1975 filing for Microsoft, the statement was that they were going to build a software company to serve the needs of this vision of a computer on every desk and in every home, again, running their software. A few years later, I did a book called Microsoft Secrets in 1995. We had a quote that Gates did in a magazine interview. And this was Gates' thinking. And remember, at the time, Paul Allen wanted to create a company creating both hardware and software for the new personal computer kits. This is Gates' comment. I thought we should do only software. When you have the microprocessor doubling in power every 2 years, in a sense, you can think of computer power as almost free. So you ask, why be in the business of making something that's almost free? What is a scarce resource? What is it that limits being able to get value out of that infinite computing power? Software, right? Steve Jobs, the very next year, also started Apple with Steve Wozniak. Now, his vision was different. He was not a programming whiz like Bill Gates. But to him, Moore's law meant that computers would be ubiquitous. They would someday be as common as toasters and typewriters. And so he wanted to create a computer so simple to use, you can just take it out of the box and start it right up. And that was the Apple II in 1978, and of course the Macintosh in 1984. And his vision evolved a bit. By 2001, his comment was, here, we think the PC is involving the future of computing lay in finding a way to allow users to create, share, and add value to the explosion of digital devices. The Mac can become the digital hub of our emerging digital lifestyle. So 2001, he was trying to build other products to pull people into the Macintosh. And eventually he abandoned that and adopted the iPhone and then the iPad, or those devices as kind of the digital hub, not necessarily the Macintosh. But the vision is kind of an evolution. Andy Grove had another vision. His idea was that Moore's law meant the vertically integrated companies that controlled everything would collapse. That mass production associated with Moore's law would mean the world would devolve into specialists and the computer industry would fragment into layers. And his determination was to dominate a very specific layer, the microprocessor layer. So we're all familiar with this industry architecture today, but that's not what it looked like. So he kind of saw that 10 years before it really happened. This is from an early Intel board presentation, the Strategic Long-Range Planning presentation of 1991, where Grove was arguing with his fellow board members and other executives that they actually needed to get rid of all their other semiconductor memory products, get rid of some systems they were building, and just focus on microprocessors. Don't build branded, or don't build Intel-branded PCs, but build Intel-branded microprocessors and just focus on that part of the industry. Here's a comment from one of Intel's senior VPs, Les Vadaz, on Andy Grove. There are many managers who make that 5-year plan, and then around year 3, they start to think about the next 5-year plan. Not Andy. Grove understood a basic truth. You can only look so far, and so you better just keep looking frequently. That's the most important element of strategy. You understand the direction you're going, but you also know what you're going to do in the next 6 months. Most companies do a pretty good job many times about direction, but then they never break it down to shorter metrics. Intel did a super job on that. Some other points on making bets. Andy Grove. There's at least one point in the history of any company when you have to change dramatically to rise to the next level of performance. Miss that moment and you start to decline. For Grove and Intel, that moment was when they decided to exit any commodity business, commodity memory chips, as well as commodity PC kinds of systems, and just focus on the real intellectual value of the platform, the microprocessor. Another quote from Steve Jobs on making bets. Dylan and Picasso were always risking failure. The Apple thing is that way for me. I don't want to fail, of course. If I try my best and fail, well, I've tried my best. Interesting about Apple is that until 2004 or so, they were largely a failing company. They had some moments of success with the Apple II and the Mac, but the Mac was actually a failed product. By the early 2000s, Apple had about 2% global market share in personal computers. Meanwhile, Microsoft was very steady, growing along with the industry, making tons of money. Part of this was the software product business model, but also it's the value of a platform company. But something changed at Apple in 2003, right? What changed? Anybody know? The iPhone? No, the iPhone was 2007. iPod was 2001. iPod and iTunes was 2001. What changed in 2003, we see in this next slide. 2003, Steve Jobs agreed to open up the iPod and iTunes to Windows users. Before that time, we argue, Apple had been really following what we call a product strategy. It was trying to win over the world by having the best product. And that took them only so far. They weren't reaching out to the 98% of the world that was essentially using other platforms, mostly Windows platforms. And Steve Jobs, almost to the end, kept fighting, oh, Windows is the enemy. We're not going to do anything to reach out to those users or even those software companies that are building software for Windows. But his executive team overruled him. And here's again where Jobs finally acknowledged that he maybe had a blind spot there. So his executive team overruled him in the late 2003 when they were again facing bankruptcy for the third time or so, and they opened it up to Windows. And again, we believe this really marked the change in Apple from a product company struggling to make their products into industry platforms to more of a platform company that was trying to bridge out to the broader base of users across the world. And of course, combining a bit more of an open philosophy towards platform thinking with great products is really what drove Apple into this tremendous success. The other thing that was interesting here was Jobs was always focused on making products very simple to use for the average person, whereas Gates and Intel were very technical. Gates and Andy Grove and others at Intel were very technical companies. So when it came to devices like the iPhone, that obsession with the user interface and simplicity, which didn't matter so much for the personal computer, really took off for these consumer devices. And that's where the explosion of demand for Apple devices came. In terms of platform thinking, Gates understood it immediately in 1980 with the DOS contract with IBM, retaining control of it, foreseeing in the future that there would be a clone industry, software companies, applications companies, as well as hardware companies, all using that foundation technology. He essentially gave it to IBM, gave the rights to IBM in exchange for retaining the rights to license it. Grove took another 10 years to understand this. He really thought the microprocessor was a component that could be swapped out for other components. And he was about to switch to RISC technology around 1990 when his executive team overruled him and said, you know, the value of our microprocessor is really in the 10 years of software assets that have been built up around DOS and now Windows. And that's what makes the x86 so valuable. So platform thinking here emerged in stages in kind of different ways, combined in different ways with philosophy of what is a product. Finally, getting to the personal anchor idea. Again, we think it's this kind of foundation of expertise and perspective that a CEO or an entrepreneur can use to ground a company and build a company around it. And again, it provides a focus, particularly in difficult times, but also for looking ahead and figuring out where you want to go. But the anchor also can have a negative side to it as well as we look at these three companies. It grounds you, but which is good, giving you a foundation in turbulent times, but it can also hold you back. So again, Microsoft's grounding in technical software and not being so concerned with users and user interface, or Intel so focused on the PC and microprocessors, were in the long run somewhat negative sides to this anchor business. But again, Gates, the deep understanding of software, Grove, this pursuit of discipline, combining manufacturing, the fab that he called it, as well as marketing, and Jobs' this unmatched sense of product design and making complex technology simpler for the average user. These were really the anchors that they built their companies around, and we can still see these anchors alive in their companies today. Other aspects of this notion of personal anchors is figuring out what you're not good at and compensating or learning. Gates, no interest in operations, but had an intense commitment to learning, think weeks, recruiting people from outside. Grove was not a semiconductor expert, but he made himself one. He also recruited lots of people to help him. And Jobs, less a technologist or entrepreneur, much more of an artist. And it wasn't until his second round in the company after 1997 that he figured out he had to hire and trust domain experts to help him run the company. One of those, of course, was Tim Cook, that he hired in the late 90s to run the supply chain. Okay, paying attention to detail, not everything, but where you can add the most leverage. Again, Jobs with the user interface, Gates with algorithms, Andy Grove with manufacturing discipline. And give power to people with the knowledge. They all had to figure out how to rely on other people in the company that in some ways knew more about the customer and the markets than they did. Okay, so one final comment on Microsoft from Paul Maritz, who later was president of the Windows division and also president of VMware, and now runs a smaller company. We were talking with Paul about, so why was Microsoft able to move pretty deftly from the PC to the internet, but failed so miserably in mobile, right? His comment to us, none of us had a consumer bone in our bodies. It just was not what really, at the end of the day, motivated us. We were system software guys. We got excited about internal architecture. In spite of protestations to the contrary, we didn't really care much about the user interface. And again, we'll argue the user interface meant everything when it came to these handheld devices. And Microsoft just never mastered it. The sad part about this, and this was tweeted around the other day, Gates realized this in 1997. He came back from a trip to Japan saying, the future is mobile devices. We have to figure out how to get Windows onto these small devices. But then he got sidetracked with antitrust, then handed the company over to Steve Ballmer in 2000, who later said, the iPhone is going to be a dud. It has no future, right? So there were a lot of missed opportunities there. So some conclusions here. One, you don't have to be perfect as a leader, right? And these three guys were very flawed. They figured out how to compensate for those flaws, though, and when they did that, they built effective organizations. Second is, we think these anchors are important to build your company around. You need to leverage that, but you have to also figure out how not to let it freeze you, how not to let it paralyze you. Microsoft got essentially so focused on the PC, they saw the world through the personal computer, but the platform had changed by the 2000s. Same thing with software as a service, and they had trouble making that transition. So how do you create an organization that is both anchored but flexible? And Apple was able to do it because they had very little to lose. 2% of the PC market, they had really nothing to lose to try to create a new platform around a device like the iPhone. The third point here is complements are not substitutes. We think in all three of these companies, the leaders chose their complementary executives as their successors. And Ballmer was a great complement to Gates, but he didn't have the same kind of vision to run the company, had no credibility with the engineers. Grove also chose a manufacturing guy to run the company after him, also did not have the same kind of vision. Steve Jobs chose Tim Cook to be his successor. So far, Tim Cook has done extraordinarily well. Whether he can demonstrate the vision that Jobs did, we don't know, but the challenge for him is to mobilize a team to do it. All right, my final slide here. So just a thought to leave with you. It's about Moore's Law. So what's occurring now that might transform your business? Again, what Grove called these inflection points, these 10x changes, right? So what are the current facts that you might use as a base for extrapolation and interpretation? How far can you see in your industry, whether it's banking or software, whatever it happens to be? What other resources might become almost free, which is really what motivated Gates? What resources might become more scarce, leading to disruptions or new opportunities, right? If you do make the right bets. Okay? So thank you, and I hope I've given you a little food for thought. So now we have 10, 15 minutes or so for Q&A. You want to see the last slide one more time? That's my favorite slide, by the way. Okay. All these slides will be posted as well. Yes?
Hi. But 1 month ago, I saw a TEDx about how the leaders of the company shouldn't give a vision because they don't know what's going to happen. Like, for example, the Pixar CEO. So he just says, I just focus on the culture of the company and then throw away the innovation. So my question for you is, like, what you have seen in your studies is that normally the leader of the startup, of the business, always set a vision of what he sees in the future and then move all the organization towards that, or he just spread the word, food for thinking, and then it comes organically?
Well, sometimes it's been the leaders of the company. Other times it's actually been people more at the mid-level of the company. So actually, in the case of Intel, this idea that the microprocessor would become a critical element of the personal computer platform was actually not something that Andy Grove or even Gordon Moore realized. It was actually the salesmen in the company, middle managers, who realized it first. And they had the authority in Intel to shift manufacturing resources to where demand was, and demand for PCs was exploding in the early 80s. And then they communicated that idea ultimately to senior management, and then they changed their whole philosophy at that time. It was framed, though, I mean, in a very big way. If you saw the way Andy Grove thought about the structure of the industry and the deeper implications of Moore's Law. So that kind of vision that we saw come out of Grove had many parts to it and came from different sources, but he did put the ideas together. Jobs, his vision evolved continuously. So again, no one can really foresee 10 years into the future, which is why we think visions have to evolve. But you do need to have a direction, and it doesn't have to come from the top. Another company I've studied closely is Toyota. And the vision for Toyota about how to win in the automobile industry through really manufacturing excellence came from an engineering manager named Taiichi Ohno, who was in charge of a machine shop. He invented the just-in-time, the lean production system in the 1940s, essentially. And eventually, he communicated it upwards. So, but there was a vision there. So we don't think great companies you can build a great company without some clear sense of what the future is going to be and a plan to actually get there and the flexibility to adapt as you're going along.
And do they sorry, one more about this. And do you believe that they bring several visions and they start following each one, or they test everyone, or just follow one and stick to it?
So in these three companies, the process was quite different. In the Microsoft process, it was Gates driving that vision, and then he surrounded himself with lots of smart people later on, including people that had failed at their companies, because he had said, I never personally experienced failure, so I want people around me who know what failure looks like. Right? And he didn't have enough of those people around him, you might argue. Intel was much more of an argumentative, confrontational process. You had Gordon Moore kind of laying out the big picture, Andy Grove interpreting it, but lots of debate and discussion. Apple was much more centralized under Steve Jobs, and one of the good things that Tim Cook has done is kind of spread the conversations out. Let me go to the next question. Yeah.
Thank you. Professor Cusumano, really enjoyed your talk.
Thanks.
I'm the CEO of GetApplause.com. It's an MIT spin-off. I was very fascinated by your point about iTunes on Windows being a platform, and In my mind, I have thought of it as more like a distribution, almost like a distribution channel. Same thing with Microsoft doing the deal with IBM, where you get a distribution channel, but you're embedded in the channel itself. You become part of the channel. That's how I've been thinking about it, and I was wondering if you've ever thought of it that way, as more of a distribution than
Well, there are different kinds of platforms. So I'm writing a new book on platforms, and one set are innovation or technology platforms like a Windows or iOS. Another set of platforms could be a distribution platform or a transaction. We call them transaction platforms. And platforms in all cases bring different groups of people together for some common purpose, whether it's to use the technology or to get access to different content, right? But iTunes is a platform. There's no question about it. It's a distribution platform for digital content. But the key idea here, though, Jobs was trying to win that market through the sheer excellence of iPod as a product, and trying to convert the world to the Macintosh through that complement actually to the Mac. Because in the early days, the only way to get any content on your iPod was to have a Macintosh, right? It all came through the Mac. You had to download iTunes content to the Mac and then sync it up with your iPod. And so he changed that. And when he did that, they had a different view of the world. So it's a move from saying we're going to become kind of the basic platform for sharing digital content for all users, not just Macintosh users. And that's what we mean by platform thinking there.
Okay, thanks.
But that's a good question. Yeah.
I was wondering your thoughts on if you've done any research into CEOs that lead by fear and the effectiveness short-term and long-term.
Well, I have studied Bill Gates very closely and also Steve Jobs. And so in many ways, Gates ruled by a kind of fear, and Jobs did as well. And I don't think it was particularly effective by itself. But so again, I know Gates a lot better than the Jobs story. Gates also had a tremendous respect from the engineers. And he said what was on his mind. So it wasn't simply that he was ruling through fear. He encouraged people to argue with him. And you were afraid of being sloppy, right? And this was also true with Jobs. But Jobs didn't have as strong, I think, an anchor as Bill Gates. So Jobs would often be influenced more by the last person he talked to, as long as that person had a very strong argument. But he had a very clear notion of what he wanted for users and the discipline that he wanted to see in design. Yeah, Gates kind of ruled through fear, Jobs as well in many ways. I actually think they both could have been more effective leaders had they been easier, in some ways, milder personalities earlier. They did evolve that way. Jobs, too, after 1997, was quite different from Jobs in the early days. So when he was essentially fired by his board during the Macintosh days because he couldn't get along with anybody, essentially, and wasn't acknowledging that the Mac was failing as a product in the marketplace. He just didn't line up enough software companies. He had some software companies, but they were all on a contractual basis. They really weren't platform partners. And he didn't really listen to people, but he learned the second time around, and we saw him much more effective once he was less confrontational. And Gates as well. Gates also learned quite a bit over time. Oh, over there, okay?
Yeah. Hey, kind of bouncing off of what was just asked over there, my question would be, what would you say when it comes to passion as a leader or as a CEO of a company in relevance to creating a company, but also in retrospect to thinking about like not just having passion and being excited, but also having the knowledge to effectively carry out the process, you know? So I guess I'm kind of looking at like, okay, it's one thing to have great passion like Steve Jobs had, but also how can you combine that together with the effective skill set, if that makes sense, to actually lead these organizations like these men do?
So we do think passion is really important, and we think some deep expertise is important, but that expertise is generally going to be incomplete. right? So Gates understood programming, didn't understand anything else, right? Didn't care much about anything else. So he needed people like Steve Ballmer and a whole range of other people to build a company. Jobs was the same way. He understood what he liked in design and whether something was easy enough for him to use, right? But he didn't know how to build anything, right? So he needed other people. So, and he focused, all three, they focused on where they could really make an impact. And we think their attention, their obsessive attention to detail taught discipline to people in the company, even for other things that they were not so knowledgeable about, whether it was design or marketing or manufacturing or operations. So as a CEO or as a founder of a company, we think you need to have something that adds value and some perspective on the world that's important and some connection to what customers value. And then the people around you have to respect you. And I think they also respect when you acknowledge that, I don't know anything about this field, and I'm going to surround myself with smart people and choose the best ones, not people whose knowledge I'm afraid of, right? A lot of weak executives hire, actually Steve Jobs has a comment on that, a lot of weak executives hire B+ people and they hire C+ people because they're afraid of them, and C+ people hire D people, then you end up with a company full of bozos, right? And none of these three CEOs were that way. They were very confident in what they knew. They also recognized what they didn't know. And I think that's what any good CEO or entrepreneur needs to do. You can't be good at everything, right?
Thank you.
Maybe
Thank you. You just answered my question. I was going to ask exactly in that sense. The Jobs followed the theory of, admit A+ people, because if you admit A, they go down, you get worse.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if the others also followed a similar philosophy in terms of building their team.
Yeah, they absolutely did. And again, in the case of Microsoft, which again, a company I studied very closely for 25 years, after a while, they got so big that they couldn't be so rigorous in their hiring. But it was a very rigorous 2-day hiring process. Almost all the tech companies since the 1980s have followed that process. Very, very rigorous recruiting. And again, try to avoid this notion that you end up with people that just need a lot of rules and bureaucracy to function properly. But when you get to be 100,000 people, you start having to make some compromises on hiring, which is why, again, we see this smaller companies often being smarter and nimbler than the bigger companies, and they need more rules to function properly, and that leads to less creativity and less ability to execute on what really is smart.
Thank you.
2 minutes left. So, okay, over there.
Thank you. My question is about having a vivid and compelling vision statement that inspires everyone when your product is, from an outside perspective, more technical, maybe, B2B. Obviously, the Microsoft example, a computer on every desk in every home is a fantastic example. But, what tips or tricks, or how do you think about that in terms of telling the best story internally when it's, from an outset, not that sexy?
Well, what's sexy to engineers may not be sexy to someone who's not an engineer. So figure out what motivates the engineers and kind of put that in your statement. But it should be very simple and clear, easy to understand, right? And easy to, obviously, that makes it easier for people to gather around and follow around it. We also think these vision statements do need to evolve at some point, right? Platforms don't change as quickly as hit products or pieces of software sometimes, but they do change, right? So whatever it is that you're doing, you need to be aware of the change as well. But vision statements maybe need to be revised every 3 to 5 years or something like that. But keep it simple. One more?
This idea of platform thinking is fascinating to me, and I was just wondering, I'm sure that many companies would like to call themselves a platform, kind of a buzzword, but in an ideal scenario, could you riff a little bit on what you would say if a company is really putting their mouth where their money where their mouth is? What would that look like in terms of their principles or?
Well, a platform is a foundation technology or or mechanism that, again, brings multiple users or other market sides together for some common purpose. But there has to be network effects to have a platform, and you have to figure out how to generate those network effects. In other words, the value of the platform or the product or the service, whatever it is, has to increase exponentially the more users who adopt it. And the kind of platforms that I've written about are more innovation platforms where there's a third party, another part of the market that's adding complementary products and services, like applications to iOS or to Windows. And so you've got to make a deliberate effort to identify opportunities for third-party companies to add to what you're doing, right? In the case of HubSpot, they've built APIs. They kind of have a small ecosystem around them, but they have more users. But the more users who are trading information or content, the more valuable the whole HubSpot ecosystem becomes, right? So if you can see those kinds of network effects and that exponential value increase, then you do have a platform. And there are many ways to cause that to happen. And the other thing that we've learned is that these platforms just don't happen by chance. Very deliberate activities. And Jobs didn't believe in that. He thought you could win the world just having the best product. So he didn't really make efforts at increasing the pie through third parties until the 2000s. Had he done it earlier, we might all be using Macintoshes today. And anyway.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your time and your questions. Great.